In the worst blizzard Montana had seen in years, a former Navy SEAL stood outside an old woman's locked cabin with 2 children and a wounded German shepherd. He did not beg. He only told her the truth. "You have no one to keep your fire alive, and I have nowhere to keep my children from freezing." Snow fell so thick on Whitaker Ridge that evening that the pine trees seemed to bow beneath it, ashamed of how much sky they had been holding. The wind came over the north slope in hard white sheets and struck Margaret Whitaker's cabin with the flat palm of winter. Inside, the old walls ticked, the stove breathed red through its iron door, and Margaret sat by the front window with her hands folded over the aluminum walker beside her. She was 80 years old, though most mornings her hip tried to convince her she was older. The wood box near the stove held 5 logs. She knew because she had counted them twice. Counting was what she did now. Logs, steps, pills, days since someone last climbed the ridge for her sake instead of their own. 9 steps from the rocker to the stove, 9 back. More if Payne got clever. Then she heard footsteps outside the gate. Not branches, not a deer. A man's footsteps, heavy but uneven, chosen carefully in the deepening snow. Behind them came a dragging scrape and one low whine that made the skin at the back of her neck tighten. People did not come to Whitaker Ridge in a blizzard. People barely came in June. Margaret pushed herself upright, muttered a word Earl would have pretended not to hear, and made the slow crossing to the door. She did not open it all the way. She leaned toward the frosted glass and saw a tall man in a navy parka, powdered white, a little boy pressed against his chest, a thin girl at his side, and a German shepherd standing between them and the wind. The dog was sable gray-brown, with a black saddle, snow-crusted on his whiskers, one ear notched as if life had taken a bite and failed to finish. Margaret opened the door 2 inches. Cold pushed in like it owned the place. "Road's closed," she called. The man turned. His beard was short, his eyes gray-blue and watchful, and a pale scar crossed his left wrist where his glove had pulled loose. "Ma'am?" he said, voice scraped raw by weather. "My truck died 2 miles down. I have 2 children with me. I can work." "No work here." "I don't need wages." "Then you're not asking for work." The girl looked up at him but said nothing. The boy coughed into the man's coat, a small, dry sound the cold seemed to sharpen. The shepherd moved at once, pressing his flank against the child's dangling boots. Margaret saw it. She wished she had not. "Name's Daniel Hayes," the man said. "This is Emma. The little one is Owen. Dog's Kodiak." "I didn't ask for a roll call." "No, ma'am." He swallowed. He kept his body angled so the wind hit him before it hit the children. "I was headed to a job near Gallatin Gateway, horse rescue place. They postponed because of the storm. I thought we could reach town before dark." "You thought wrong." "Yes, ma'am." That irritated her more than argument. Argument gave a person something clean to shut out. Agreement left fingerprints. "There's a church in Bozeman. Reverend Hale lets folks sleep in the basement when weather turns. We came from there yesterday. Basement was full. He gave us soup and a blanket." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked mouth. God provided soup. The blanket had opinions. The little girl made a sound that almost became laughter. Margaret hated that she nearly joined her. She tightened both hands around the walker. "You have family?" Daniel looked past her for half a second toward the dim room behind. "Not the kind that opens doors." "Well, that makes 2 of us." His gaze returned to her and something in it changed. Not pity. Worse. Accuracy. He saw the walker, the low wood box, the single worn chair, the unshoveled porch, and he understood too fast. "You have no one to keep your fire alive," he said quietly. "And I have nowhere to keep my children from freezing." The word struck the porch and stayed there. Margaret felt blood climb into her face. No one had spoken to her like that in 16 years. No one had named the thing she had spent all that time dressing up as independence. "Who do you think you are?" she said. "Nobody tonight. Tomorrow I can be a handyman. I can split wood, clear the roof line, fix that gutter before it tears off, check your generator, thaw a pump if you have one. We could sleep in the shed. Kodiak will warn if anything comes close. We won't touch what isn't offered." "And I should believe that because you say so?" "No, ma'am." He looked down at Owen, whose cough had started again. "You should believe I won't let my children become thieves before they learn long division." Emma lowered her eyes. Margaret heard the pride in that poor and stubborn and nearly useless. She knew that kind. It had kept her from asking help after she fell behind the house 3 weeks ago and lay in the snow until dark, dragging herself to the porch rail inch by inch while no one passed the road. "Go to town," she said. "Keep the fence on your right. Miller's mailbox is half a mile down." Daniel looked toward the road which no longer existed, except as whiteness. "Yes, ma'am." He did not plead. That was his mistake, or his virtue. He bent stiffly one knee, resisting, and adjusted Kodiak's small pack. The shepherd stared at Margaret with eyes the color of wet oak. "Don't look at me like that," she snapped. Kodiak sneezed snow from his nose. Daniel did not take the road. He led the children to the outside of the fence, tied a tarp between 2 posts, and settled Owen behind it with Emma crouched close. Kodiak lay broadside to the wind. Daniel knelt in the snow to hold the tarp line when the gusts pulled. Margaret shut the door. The latch clicked like a judgment. She crossed back to the stove, fed it one log she could not spare, and sat in the rocker with the red shawl slipping from her knees. She told herself people survived worse. She had survived worse. When Caleb died in the avalanche chute, neighbors came 2 weeks, 2 days. When Rachel's cancer thinned her to a whisper, the casseroles lasted a month. When Earl died, no one came after the funeral except Harold asking for money and Clay Ramsey asking about land in that polished way of his. Margaret had learned to keep doors closed because open doors let grief find new furniture. She told herself the man outside had chosen pride. He could have pushed the gate. It did not even lock. That thought scratched at her all evening. Near midnight, the temperature dropped. The windows tightened in their frames. Outside, a child's cough tore through the wind. Then Kodiak began to howl, deep, controlled, urgent, not like a wild animal, but like a working dog filing a report no decent soul could ignore. Margaret opened her eyes in the dark. Her hip burned before she moved. The dog howled again. This time it sounded almost like a name. The blizzard had made Whitaker Ridge into a white room without walls, and Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, listening to a German shepherd ask for mercy in a language older than speech. Every sensible part of her said to stay put. She was 80. The porch boards would be ice. The yard was 30 yards when the ground was kind, and tonight the ground was not kind. Yet the child's cough came again, thin and wrong, followed by Kodiak's low, urgent howl. Margaret cursed. Not prettily. Earl would have raised his eyebrows. Rachel would have laughed into her sleeve. "Fine," Margaret said to the dark room. "Fine, Lord, but don't stand there looking pleased with yourself." She found her socks pulled on, boots, shoved herself into a coat crooked over her nightgown, and took hold of the walker. The metal was cold enough to bite. The first step hurt. The second hurt worse because by then she knew exactly what the rest would cost. She crossed the kitchen and stopped at the front door with her hand on the bolt. Shame rose in her throat, bitter as old pennies. Not fear. She knew fear well enough. This was the taste of discovering that suffering had not made her kinder, only harder. She opened the door. Wind threw snow over her boots. "Dog!" she shouted. Kodiak barked once from the gate, sharp and exact. Margaret went down the porch step by step, walker sliding, boots sinking. She moved by planting the frame, shifting one foot, dragging the other, and muttering the names of the dead she had not meant to bring with her. Earl, because he had shoveled that path every winter. Caleb, because he would have carried her while pretending she weighed less than feed. Rachel, because Rachel would have brought blankets first and scolded later. When Margaret reached the gate, her lungs felt lined with glass. Daniel was kneeling in the drift, one arm around Emma, the other holding the tarp against the wind. Owen lay wrapped between the girl and the shepherd. Kodiak stood over them, fur stiff with ice eyes locked on Margaret, as if he had personally summoned her and found her slow. "Don't you judge me, you hairy sergeant!" she rasped. Daniel looked up. Snow clung to his lashes. "Ma'am, push the gate!" He stared. "What? Push the blessed gate before Charity kills me!" He rose and pressed it inward. It opened with a soft scrape. Only then did Margaret understand that he had known it was unlocked. He had waited because she had not invited him. That nearly undid her. Kodiak entered first, circling back to Emma. Daniel lifted Owen. Emma carried the tarp bundle and followed, chin down, lips blue. None of them rushed past the old woman. "Inside!" Margaret barked. "Before I remember my personality!" The kitchen received them with iron stove heat, old wood tea leaves, and the faint lavender Margaret kept in a bowl because Rachel once said grief should at least smell clean. Daniel paused on the mat, dripping. "Boots!" "Floor's older than your manners. Get in." He obeyed. Emma unclipped Kodiak's pack with numb fingers. The dog shook once, spraying melted snow across the cabinet doors. Margaret glared. Kodiak looked back untroubled. "I don't like him," Emma spoke for the first time. "He doesn't mind." It was so dry that Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, either embarrassed or grateful. Margaret pointed at the stove. "Wood's in the box, kettle's on the shelf. If your hands work, use them." Daniel moved at once. He laid Owen across 2 chairs with his coat under the boy's head, opened the stove, judged the coals, added pine, adjusted the damper, and coaxed flame with one steady breath. Not a wasted motion. Margaret noticed. Useless men made noise in kitchens. Daniel did not. Emma stood near the table with Kodiak pressed against her knees. "Come by the stove," Margaret said. The girl looked at Daniel. He nodded. She obeyed slowly, as if the floor might remember she was trespassing. Margaret crossed to the pantry, each step making the walker click. Bread, apple, butter, bacon, cheddar. She set them on the table. Daniel turned. "Ma'am, no. You gave us shelter. I gave you my kitchen, wet enough to skate on. Sit. We can pay by morning. I can work. You can work after your boy stops sounding like a rusty hinge." That silenced him. He looked at Owen, and all the command drained from his shoulders. There was the hole in the armor. Not bullets, not storms. A child breathing badly. Daniel sat, but he did not eat until Emma had eaten and Owen had taken warm water. Kodiak received nothing, and stared so dramatically that Margaret tossed him bacon fat on a cracked saucer. "That is not friendship, that is disposal." His tail thumped once. Daniel's mouth twitched. The boy warmed by degrees. Color returned to his cheeks. Emma's hands stopped shaking. The 4 chairs around the table, unused together for 16 years, looked suddenly less like witnesses and more like furniture. "Where's their mother?" Margaret asked before kindness could make her cowardly. Daniel's hand went still. Emma looked down. "Dead," he said. 2 years. 2 years and 4 months, Emma whispered. Daniel swallowed. 2 years and 4 months, Margaret nodded once. Sorrow did not need a sermon. It needed a place to sit. "You can use the shed at first light," she said. "If the roof still has opinions of its own, fix them." Daniel looked up. "At first light we'll go." "Did I ask you to go?" He stared. The old woman grew angry to hide the heat rising in her face. "The pump froze twice this week. The generator coughs worse than your boy. The north gutter is hanging by one nail. Wood piles under a drift because I can't reach the shed, and 3 weeks ago I fell by the back step." Her pride slammed shut, but she pushed a shoulder against it. "I lay there until dark. Your dog could have found me faster than my kin." Daniel said nothing for a long while. "I can fix the pump." Margaret looked toward the window where snow erased the fence. "Then don't leave before breakfast." Morning came gray, the storm tired but still present. Margaret woke in the rocker with a blanket over her knees she had not placed there. The dishes were washed. Coffee sat on the stove far too strong. Outside, Daniel crossed the yard toward the shed, limping through deep snow with a shovel over one shoulder. Kodiak trotted ahead, nose low. Emma carried kindling. Owen watched from the porch, wrapped in Margaret's red shawl, solemn as a judge. Margaret stood at the window with both hands on the walker and felt fear rise, not that they would stay, but that they would not. Then Kodiak stopped by the north fence. His body changed in an instant, tail rigid, head low. Daniel lifted one hand, and Emma froze. The dog scratched through powder to black earth and frozen mud, tire tracks, fresh ones. They led to the old survey marker where no truck had any business being. Daniel looked back toward the cabin with the expression of a man who had found a tripwire under a welcome mat. The next morning, on Whitaker Ridge, snow softened into powder so quiet Daniel trusted it less than wind. Noise had always been useful to him. It told a man where danger lived. Silence let danger move around. He stood beside the north fence with a shovel in one hand while Kodiak nosed the half-buried tire tracks and sneezed with professional contempt. The ridge road had been closed since the storm. No neighbor would have climbed this grade for pleasure, and no delivery truck could have made it by mistake. Someone had driven close to the old survey marker and left 2 grooves under new snow. Daniel crouched, ignoring the bite in his right knee. Emma hovered 6 paces behind him with kindling pressed to her chest. "Inside," he said. She did not move. "Emma, you say that when something is bad." "I say it when you're cold. That's not true." She was 8, which meant lies had to be built better. Daniel turned. "Please." That word still cost him. He could order men through surf in the dark, but asking his daughter to trust him sometimes felt like reaching into a drawer full of broken glass. Emma looked at Kodiak. The shepherd had lifted his head toward the road, ears angled, breath steaming. She went inside. Margaret's voice came from the porch. "If you two are done admiring dirt, the pump remains frozen." Daniel looked back. She stood wrapped in the red shawl, walker planted like a gate of its own. "Someone was here last night." "Someone is always somewhere." "Near your property line?" Her eyes flickered toward the marker. "The ridge has had greedy eyes on it since before snow learned to fall." She turned, making the subject sound settled, but Daniel kept the tracks in his mind. By noon, the cabin had begun accepting them in small, unwilling ways. Daniel thawed the pump line with warm towels and a heat lamp he found under 3 dead mousetraps. He cleaned the generator carburetor, while Margaret told him he was using the wrong wrench until he handed her the right one without looking. He shoveled a trench from porch to shed, deep enough that Owen called it a castle road. Kodiak claimed the route as commander. Whenever Owen drifted near the woodpile, the dog nudged him back by the coat. When Margaret dropped a mitten and reached down with a curse already rising, Kodiak picked it up and placed it in her lap. She stared at him. "I did not ask." The dog sat. "I did not thank you either." His tail brushed the floor once. Owen giggled. Margaret failed not to smile. Daniel saw it and pretended he had not, which seemed to be one of the house rules. The arrangement settled by evening. Daniel and the children would sleep in the shed once he patched the roof and made the camp stove safe. Until then, The kitchen floor would do. He would work for shelter. Margaret would complain in place of conversation. Emma would answer only when cornered. Owen would follow Kodiak as if the dog had been elected mayor. Nobody used the word family. That word waited outside with snow on its shoulders. On the fourth day, the storm loosened. Daniel cleared the roof with the rope around his waist, and Kodiak, lying at the ladder's base, offended that humans kept climbing things. Margaret watched from the porch. "Your knee's bad. It's fine. I have owned bad knees longer than you've owned that beard." He pushed snow from the eaves. "Old injury. War." The shovel paused. "Training." It was close enough to true for daylight. The real damage had happened later, in a doorway full of smoke, when the world turned orange and his friend Luis shoved him clear before the ceiling came down. But the knee was a simpler story, and simple stories fit better in strangers' hands. Margaret let him keep it. That surprised him. Most people pulled at silence like loose thread. That night, the first bad sound came. A county plow groaned somewhere below the ridge, its metal blades scraping frozen gravel. It was ordinary, useful even. Daniel was setting cups on the table when the scrape hit the air at the wrong rhythm. Metal on gravel became metal on concrete. Plow growl became rotor thunder. The kitchen vanished. His hand tightened around a mug until coffee spilled over his fingers. He saw dust, smelled burning wire, heard Luis laughing 1 second before the blast, some stupid joke about powdered eggs. Then Kodiak crossed the room, hard and fast, nails skittering body pressing against Daniel's leg. Lean, wait, now. Daniel dragged in air. The stove returned, pine smoke, apple butter, Emma standing near the pantry, white-faced, Owen silent under the table, clutching his yellow hat. Margaret did not speak for several seconds. That was the mercy of it. Then she said, "Sit down before you baptize my floor in coffee." He sat because his legs had become unreliable. Kodiak shoved his head under Daniel's hand. "I'm all right," Daniel said. No one believed him. Margaret set a basin of cold water near his burned fingers. "I didn't ask for a performance report." He looked at her and saw no pity, only recognition. Different war, same weather inside. "Does it happen often?" she asked. "Less than before. That means yes." He almost smiled. "You know many veterans?" "I knew one who came home from Korea and sat facing every door for 30 years. I married his brother. So I learned the difference between rudeness and listening for death." Emma's mouth trembled, but she did not cry. That hurt Daniel more than tears. After supper, when Daniel took Owen to the shed to arrange blankets, Emma stayed behind to collect cups. Margaret sat by the stove, mending her shawl badly. "You run from me like I collect children in jars," she said. Emma stopped. "I don't run. You leave every room I enter. That is running with manners." The girl held a cup in both hands. "I'm not scared of you." "Then why?" Outside, Daniel's low voice told Owen not to feed crackers to Kodiak because the dog already considered himself underpaid. Emma looked toward the sound. "Because you're going to die." Margaret's needle froze. "That's a bold diagnosis. You're older than Grandma Ruth was. You use that." Emma nodded toward the walker. "Mom died, Grandma Ruth died, Dad's friend Luis died, and Dad still talks to him when he's asleep. If I like you, you'll die too, and then Dad will say, 'Breathe, Bug, breathe,' and I'll have to be brave again." The cup rattled in her hands. "I hate brave." Some sentences enter a room and rearrange the furniture of a person's soul. Margaret had heard several. The phone call after Caleb. The doctor's quiet voice about Rachel. Earl saying he was tired in a way sleep could not fix. Now this child had placed another beside them. Emma set the cup down and left before Margaret could rescue herself with sharpness. Later, Daniel found Margaret staring toward the hall. "Everything okay?" he asked. In the pantry, behind the flour tin, there's a blue biscuit box. He waited. Inside is a key. To what? Her hand trembled once beneath the shawl. A room I have not opened in 16 years. From outside came Emma calling Kodiak to bed. The shepherd barked, cheerful and bossy. Margaret closed her eyes. Tomorrow I want you behind me when I open it. If I fall, catch me. If I curse, ignore me. If I cry, you saw nothing. Morning came pale over Whitaker Ridge, with storm clouds lifting in torn gray strips and the snow lying everywhere like a clean lie. The cabin looked smaller in that light. The kettle dented near the spout, the rocker worn smooth by 16 years of one body, the family photograph turned slightly toward the wall, the narrow stairs leading to the attic door. Margaret ate half a piece of toast and complained that Daniel had scraped it with too much sympathy. He did not ask what that meant. He was learning that Margaret used insult the way other people used salt, sparingly. When calm, heavily, when afraid. Emma sat beside Owen without looking at the old woman. Kodiak lay under the table with his chin on Daniel's boot, one torn ear twitching whenever the wind worried the eaves. No one mentioned the key until the dishes were washed. Then Margaret said, "Well, if we're going to make fools of ourselves, let's do it before lunch." Daniel fetched the blue biscuit box. Inside, wrapped in a handkerchief, lay a black iron key so ordinary it seemed almost insulting. A key ought to look dramatic if it carried 16 years. Margaret took it with 2 fingers. "Children, stay down here." Emma looked up. "Why?" "Because grief is not a petting zoo." Daniel almost choked on the air. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Was that nearly a laugh, Mr. Hayes?" "No, ma'am." "Liar." A small warmth moved through the kitchen. Emma watched it suspiciously as children do when adults create unfamiliar weather. Daniel crouched before her. "I'll be right upstairs. Kodiak stays with you." The shepherd raised his head, then thumped his tail once, accepting the assignment he had expected. Margaret climbed the stairs with Daniel behind her. Each step complained. He kept one hand near her back without touching. Men in the service learned restraint around explosives. Living with Margaret taught the same lesson around pride. At the top, a short landing held the attic door under the roof slope. Dust had gathered along the threshold like ash. Margaret inserted the key. It did not turn. "Of course," she muttered. "Even the lock has opinions." She tried again. Her wrist shook. On the 3rd attempt, she held out her hand without looking back. Daniel covered it with his, not taking over, only lending pressure. The key moved with a rusty click. The door opened inward. Cold air breathed out, carrying dust, dry wood, wool, and beneath it something nearly impossible. Lavender soap and pencil shavings preserved in the dark as if the house had refused to spend them. Margaret gripped the frame. Daniel stood behind her, and for a moment the room was not a room but a wound with a door on it. 2 narrow beds rested under the eaves, quilts tucked tight though 16 winters had passed. A shelf held model planes, a cracked baseball, school readers, and a stone, polished by a creek. On the far wall hung a blue cardigan with pearl buttons too young in shape for an old woman. Beside one bed sat a little sled made from pine, one runner split and repaired by patient hands. Margaret took one step inside. The walker snagged on the rug. Daniel steadied the back bar without making a ceremony of it. She pretended not to notice. "Earl made that sled for Caleb after the first big snow of '89, she said. "Boy rode it straight into the chicken coop and came out with feathers in his hair, smiling like he had discovered flight." Rachel laughed until she hiccuped. Daniel listened. His own memories flared when other people opened theirs, Catherine barefoot in a Norfolk kitchen, laughing because Emma had put cereal in his boots. Luis in a barracks room tossing a stress ball at the ceiling and saying command only called misery character building when it happened to somebody else. Daniel swallowed. Margaret touched the sled. Caleb was 19 when the avalanche took him. He knew that chute. Everyone knew that chute. Snow doesn't care who knows what. She lifted the blue cardigan with 2 fingers. Rachel died 6 years later. Cancer. I watched my girl become smaller than the sweaters I made her. Earl lasted 2 winters after that. Doctors said his heart. I was there. I know what carried him off. Daniel said, I'm sorry. That phrase is a thin blanket, but people keep handing it out. It's all I have. She looked at him then, and the sharpness left her face for one tired second. I know. Downstairs, Owen laughed, followed by Kodiak's tail thumping a cabinet. Emma shushed them with unnecessary authority. Margaret closed her eyes at the sound. That child told me I am going to die. Emma says cruel things when she's afraid. Cruel and true are cousins. They visit together. Daniel shifted. She lost her mother on black ice outside Norfolk. I was in treatment at the VA. Catherine called twice. Phones were in a box during group. I was angry enough that day to obey rules. By the time I called back, she was gone. Emma remembers the phone ringing in my jacket pocket at the funeral. She thinks if I had answered sooner, the world would have turned around. Children believe adults are powerful because the alternative is unbearable. Margaret opened a cedar chest and found a gray sweater folded beneath tissue paper. She held it against her chest, then shoved it at Daniel. Take this downstairs. Why? Because your daughter left something behind. His face tightened. Her mother's bear. I heard. You don't have to. Margaret's eyes flashed. At my age, the list of things I don't have to do is enormous. Move. For 5 days, she disappeared after lunch with thread needles, stuffing, and 2 black buttons. Daniel heard swearing through the door. Emma was asked whether bear ears were round or foolish. Kodiak stole a wad of stuffing and carried it proudly to Owen, who called it snow meat. Margaret declared the dog a military criminal. On Sunday morning, under a clear blue sky, Margaret came to breakfast with both hands hidden beneath the red shawl. Child, she said. Emma froze. Come here. Emma came 3 steps. Margaret placed a small bear on the table. It was made from Rachel's gray sweater, lopsided one ear round and the other surprised belly, uneven one black button eye higher than the other, and a patch of blue cardigan stitched over the heart. It is poorly made, Margaret said quickly. My hands don't listen, and bears are ridiculous to construct. If you don't want it, I'll give it to the dog and he can arrest it. Kodiak lifted his head. Emma stared. It isn't your mother's, Margaret said more softly. Nothing is, but it is made from someone loved, and maybe loved cloth remembers the shape of holding. Emma crossed the room so suddenly Daniel half rose. She did not take the bear first. She threw herself into Margaret's lap, fierce around the old woman's bones, and cried as if the storm had found a door inside her. Margaret sat, rigid arms raised. Then slowly, with the caution of someone handling a wholly breakable thing, she held the girl. Daniel turned toward the sink because his eyes had betrayed him. Outside, beyond the frost-bright window, a black SUV idled at the bend. A man inside watched the soldier wipe his face, the old woman hold a child not of her blood, and the German shepherd lift his head toward the glass. Then the SUV drove away, leaving 2 dark tracks in the snow. The first clear Sunday after the blizzard, Whitaker Ridge shone with the hard Montana brightness that makes the world look newly forged and entirely unforgiving. Snow lay deep in the pasture smooth, except where Daniel had cut paths from cabin to shed to woodpile to pump every trench straight enough to look ordered by a man who mistrusted chaos. He counted small things when large ones pressed too close. 14 logs split before breakfast. 7 steps from Margaret's rocker to the stove. 2 seconds between Owen's coughs when cold found him. 1 child crying into an old woman's chest and not apologizing for it. The large number waiting in the cabin was 16 the years Margaret had not gone to the graves below the ridge. She announced the trip while Daniel tightened a bolt on the generator. "We're going to the cemetery." He looked up. "Today? No, Mr. Hayes, in July, when my bones have filed a formal complaint. Today." Emma, brushing Kodiak near the shed, went still. The shepherd stood patiently while ice came out of his belly fur, looking insulted by maintenance. Owen sat on an overturned bucket, naming pine cones after breakfast foods. Daniel wiped grease from his fingers. "It's steep. Snow's crusted. Your hip won't like it." "My hip has not liked anything since Reagan. It survives disappointment." She looked toward the road. For 1 second, the bossy shape of her fell away, and Daniel saw an old woman facing a distance that had grown longer each year she avoided it. "Earl kept a hand sled in the barn, for feed sacks. If it still has runners, put blankets on it. If it doesn't, fix them." It took 2 hours. The sled's bolts had rusted, 1 runner had warped, and a squirrel had filled the corner with pine cone shavings that Owen called treasure, until Margaret said treasure did not usually smell like a damp attic. Daniel repaired the runner with scrap steel and wrapped the seat in quilts from the cedar chest. Getting Margaret onto it was an ordeal. She objected to his grip, the sled's height, the indignity of blankets, the existence of gravity, and the way Kodiak stared as if taking notes. "If you tell anyone I traveled downhill like a sack of flour, I will haunt your coffee." Daniel tightened the guide rope. "Ma'am, with respect, you already haunt my coffee." Emma gasped. Margaret stared at him, then laughed, rusty and startled, a sound that flew over the snow like a bird remembering wings. The trip down took 90 minutes. Daniel walked ahead with the rope around his waist, while Kodiak trotted beside him in harness, offended whenever the man failed to appreciate canine engineering. Emma stayed at Margaret's side, with the gray bear tucked under one arm. Owen rode for 5 minutes, declared the sled too wiggly, and chose to march with Kodiak, who accepted the escort with saintly irritation. The road smelled of pine resin, iron cold, and far wood smoke. Halfway down, a woman in a blue coat stopped shoveling her porch. "Maggie Whitaker." Margaret lifted her chin. "Unless winter has improved me into someone else." The woman put a hand to her mouth. "We thought you didn't come down anymore. And yet here I am lowering property values by surviving." Daniel had to stop walking because Emma was laughing into her mitten. Even Kodiak glanced back as if morale had improved. The cemetery sat behind a white clapboard church at the bottom of the ridge, fenced under leafless cottonwoods. Reverend Thomas Hale was sweeping the steps when he saw them. He was broad, silver-haired, red-nosed, and kind in the careful way of a man who had offered soup to more people than he could save. "Mrs. Whitaker," he called, then noticed Daniel. "Mr. Hayes." Daniel nodded. The Reverend looked at the children, the sled, the dog, and the old woman wrapped like a queen, delivered to judgment. He asked no questions. He opened the gate and cleared a path. "They're under the cottonwood at the back," Margaret said. Her sharpness had thinned like ice over running water. Daniel helped her stand, but she refused his arm for the final 20 steps. "These are mine. I'll walk to them." It took 8 minutes. No one hurried. Snow squeaked under the walker tips. At the graves, 3 stones leaned slightly toward one another, as if still in conversation beneath the ground. Earl Whitaker, Caleb Whitaker, Rachel Whitaker. Daniel knelt and brushed snow from the letters. Emma wiped Rachel's stone with her sleeve. Owen stood before the smallest marker, removed his yellow hat, and placed it on top. "She cold," he said. Margaret made a sound low in her throat.
Rachel hated hats, said they flattened her hair. Owen considered this one good. Tears spilled before Margaret could forbid them. She stared at the names as if they might look back. Earl, she said, and the name cracked open the air. I brought visitors.
Reverend Hale took off his hat. Daniel did too. Margaret said Caleb next, then Rachel, each name clumsy from disuse. Daniel thought of Catherine's grave in Virginia, visited twice, and avoided since because Emma always asked why the grass looked normal over someone so important. Grief did not disappear. It changed uniforms and waited outside formation. On the way back, sunset turned the snow rose, then blue. Margaret was exhausted, but her eyes were clearer. Near the cabin, she asked, "How long did you plan to stay?" Daniel kept walking. "Until the roads hold. Then I need to find work. That is not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She was quiet. "I have a roof. You have hands. The children leave crumbs in places only a dog can respect. Seems wasteful to end the arrangement quickly." Daniel turned. "Are you asking us to stay?" She looked at the tree line. "I am stating the pump will freeze again. That's not the same. At my age, it is close enough." By the time they reached the porch, the cabin windows glowed gold. Daniel felt something ease in his chest at the sight. Not safety, exactly, but a sketch of it. Then Emma stopped. A white envelope was wedged in the door frame, stiff with cold. Margaret recognized the embossed name before Daniel read it aloud. Ramsey Mountain Development. Inside was a polite offer to purchase Whitaker Ridge, and a colder line noting concern that an unrelated transient veteran and minor children had taken residence with an elderly owner during winter isolation. Daniel read it twice. The small numbers vanished. Someone had been watching them. Wind returned to Whitaker Ridge on Monday, thin and needling, lifting loose snow from the yard and driving it in pale snakes across Daniel's trenches. The cabin wore the day inside out. Everything felt exposed. The porch, the north fence, the tire marks under new powder, the white envelope on the kitchen table with Ramsey Mountain Development printed so cleanly it seemed indecent. Margaret read the letter once. She did not need more. Paper had a smell when it came from men who wanted land. Ink starch confidence and the faint rot of having already decided the answer. "Clay Ramsey," she said. "Bought the old ski lodge beyond Miller's pasture. Wants an access road across my ridge. Been sniffing at it 3 years." Daniel tightened the bandage around his burned hand. Emma sat beside Owen, pretending to show him how to stack kindling while really listening. Kodiak lay by the door with his nose pointed toward the road. "You told him no?" Daniel asked. "Repeatedly. I used different tones in case he was hard of hearing." "Is he dangerous?" Emma asked. Margaret answered too fast. "No." Daniel heard the lie by its speed. Margaret heard him hear it and scowled. "Dangerous is a large word. He won't break a window. He'll bring forms. Forms are quieter and leave fewer fingerprints." That afternoon, Clay Ramsey arrived in a black SUV polished enough to reflect the snow, as if even weather had been hired. Kodiak rose without barking, which Daniel found worse than noise. He stepped onto the porch with his hands visible. Clay got out wearing a charcoal coat, leather gloves, and boots that had not learned hardship. He was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, pleasant mouth, empty eyes. Men like that used courtesy the way other men used rope. "Mr. Hayes," Clay called, "I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Whitaker." "She can hear you from here." "I'm sure she can. The elderly often hear what they choose." Daniel felt a quick, bright flash in his chest. Kodiak pressed against his leg. Lean, wait, reminder. Daniel opened his fingers one by one. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wrapped in the red shawl. "If you've come to admire the snow, Clay, do it from the road." Clay smiled. Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitaker. I'm relieved to see you're well. Then brace yourself. Relief can turn on a man. His gaze passed over Daniel into the cabin, where Emma stood in the kitchen shadows and Owen peered around her coat. This is exactly what concerns me. My furniture, your situation. An elderly woman alone in winter, suddenly housing a stranger and two minors. A former military man with documented medical issues, if I understand correctly. Daniel's vision narrowed. VA intake forms, therapy notes, words like hypervigilance typed by people who had never seen his living room at 3 in the morning. He took one step before he knew it. Clay did not move. That was the bait. Margaret's walker struck the porch board. Daniel. Not loud. Enough. He stopped. Kodiak moved between them, hackles high, teeth unseen. Clay looked at the dog with distaste. I don't dislike veterans. My father served. Most men with cruel manners have a relative they bring out for washing, Margaret said. Clay's smile thinned. Mrs. Whitaker, you and I can speak privately. My hearing's old, not my judgment. Then I'll be direct. This ridge is valuable. The cabin needs work. The well is old. The access road is unsafe. You have no immediate family in residence. My offer includes a life estate. You stay as long as you live. Margaret tilted her head. How thoughtful. You buy my land, and as a kindness you wait for me to die in my own house. That's an ugly way to phrase a practical arrangement. Practical arrangements often look better before daylight hits them. Clay turned to Daniel. And what is your arrangement? Work for shelter, cash, a promise? Has Mrs. Whitaker reviewed anything with counsel since you arrived? Daniel said nothing. Silence could be a locked door if a man held it steady. Clay stepped closer. You have children. You understand responsibility. If someone reports they are sleeping in an unheated shed or depending on an unstable elderly woman, county services may have questions. If someone suggests you are influencing her property decisions, other people may ask harder ones. Emma sucked in a breath. Daniel bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste blood. Margaret heard it too. Her face changed. Clay Ramsey, you came to my house in a storm week to frighten a child. I came to protect you. No, you came to count windows and weaknesses. You saw a man with a limp, a girl with scared eyes, a little boy in a hand-me-down hat, and an old woman using a walker, and you mistook all that for permission. Clay's jaw tightened. You may regret this. At 80, regret is crowded. Take a number. He looked at Daniel. One day she will fall. Maybe tonight. Maybe next month. And you will decide whether to lift her or load your children into whatever truck still runs and disappear before questions start. Men under pressure reveal themselves. Kodiak growled low. Owen began to cry inside the cabin. That sound snapped Daniel back harder than any command. He turned from Clay and knelt before his son. You're all right, buddy. We're all right. Margaret watched Daniel choose the child over the fight, and something in her softened so briefly only Clay missed it. Leave, she said. This is private property. Clay put his gloves back on. For now. No, Clay, not for now. Mine. He gave a small bow that insulted everyone present, returned to the SUV, and drove down the ridge without spinning once. Inside, Owen held Daniel's cuff and would not let go. Emma stood at the window. Is he going to take us away? Daniel said. No. The lie was necessary, and he hated it. Margaret sat heavily in the rocker. Color gone. Daniel crouched before her and checked her pulse. He got to you. He got to you first. Yes. The honesty surprised them both. Margaret looked toward Emma Owen and Kodiak, who had planted himself across the doorway like a furry barricade with grievances. There is a lawyer in town. Beverly Sutton, awful woman, sensible shoes, tells the truth as if charging by the bruise. You trust her?
I dislike her, which is often cleaner. A log collapsed in the stove, throwing sparks against iron. Margaret closed her eyes. Tomorrow, if the road holds you, take me to her. For what? Paperwork. The kind men like Clay hate because it speaks after women like me are dead. Outside, the ridge went quiet, and Daniel knew quiet was when the next move began.
Tuesday dawned over Whitaker Ridge with a brittle blue sky and a cold so clear it seemed to ring when Daniel opened the cabin door. Snowbanks along the road had hardened overnight, their sides cut by the county plow into walls taller than Owen. Reverend Hale's borrowed truck waited in the yard, with chains on the tires and a heater that produced more faith than warmth. Margaret came out wrapped in her black coat and red shawl, hair-braided boots polished with the thoroughness of a woman preparing for battle. If this truck dies on the hill, I will not be buried in a Ford. Daniel opened the passenger door. It's a Chevy. Then I will not be buried in a mistake. Emma smiled into her scarf. Owen, strapped in back beside her, repeated mistake until Daniel gave him the look. Kodiak jumped into the truck bed under a canvas cover, offended by not being consulted. They drove slowly, chains clattering. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes moving. He counted bends. 5 to Miller's mailbox. 11 to the church. 23 minutes to town if the road held. Counting kept his mind away from Clay's letter and Margaret's purse, and from the phrase county services, which had entered him like a sliver. Bozeman sat below with chimney smoke rising and mountains shining beyond Main Street like a jury of old white faces. People looked when the truck pulled in. They looked harder when Daniel helped Margaret down, when Kodiak leapt out and sat at heel, when Emma took Owen's hand and walked close but not hidden. Beverly Sutton's office stood between a bakery and a tax preparer, a narrow brick storefront with green trim and a brass plaque polished to a shine no storm could dull. Inside, the air smelled of paper coffee and lemon oil. Beverly was in her 60s, square-shouldered, gray hair cut at her jaw, glasses on a chain, shoes sensible enough to survive any opinion. She came from behind the desk. Maggie Whitaker? I wondered what mountain had swallowed you. The same one Clay Ramsey is trying to digest. Beverly's eyes moved to Daniel, the children, the dog. She did not smile, which made Daniel trust her a little. And this is my current scandal. Does your scandal have a name? Daniel Hayes, he said. Emma, Owen, and Kodiak. Beverly looked at the shepherd. Is he trained? Better than most people. That is not difficult. Margaret made a small, approving sound. Beverly pointed to chairs. You and the children wait there. Margaret raised one hand. Outside? Daniel frowned. Ma'am, outside, hallway, street, moon, if you prefer. You will not hear what I say, and you will not ask. If this goes before a judge, I will not have Clay Ramsey's lawyer claiming you breathed near my decisions. Daniel understood. His stomach tightened. Margaret, do not use that voice. It sounds noble, and I am too old for nobility before noon. Emma's eyes searched her face. Did we do something wrong? Margaret softened, then covered it by adjusting her shawl. No, child. That is why you wait outside. Daniel led them into the hall. Kodiak followed after Beverly gave him a look that suggested even dogs could compromise testimony. They sat beneath a framed county map. Owen fell asleep against Daniel's side. Emma held the gray bear in her lap. Is she sending us away? No. You don't know. Daniel stared at the opposite wall. No, I don't. Emma nodded as if the honest pain of that could be trusted. Inside the office, Margaret slid Clay's letter across the desk. Beverly read it without expression. He's early. You expected him? Clay watches land the way coyotes watch lambing season. Your North Ridge cuts 12 minutes off his access road. I need a will. Beverly removed a yellow legal pad. You have one. Earl's old document leaves everything to you, then to his nearest surviving kin if you die without issue. Harold, yes. Change it. Beverly uncapped her pen. To whom? Margaret looked toward the frosted glass where Daniel's shape bent over sleeping Owen, one hand behind the boy's head so it would not hit the wall. Emma sat beside him, pretending not to lean on his sleeve. To Daniel Hayes and his children Emma and Owen. All of it. Cabin, 22 acres, well, barn, tools, chickens, generator, my rocking chair, if the ugly thing outlives me. Beverly's pen did not move. How long have you known him? Long enough. That is not a legal measurement. 12 days, Beverly set the pen down. Maggie, don't start. I have an obligation. Clay will say he influenced you. Harold may say it if Clay buys him lunch. A judge will ask why an elderly widow left everything to an unrelated man she knew less than 2 weeks. Margaret leaned forward, hands shaking in her lap where they could be private. Because that unrelated man stood outside my gate in a blizzard with 2 children and did not push it though it was open. Because his dog lay over them while I sat inside being righteous and useless. Because since he came there is water in my pump, wood by my stove, and a little boy leaving jam fingerprints on my table. Because his daughter cried in my lap, Beverly and I had not been needed by a child in 16 years. Beverly lowered her eyes. Does he know? No. Will you tell him? No. He would refuse out of decency, and decency can be a nuisance, Beverly resumed writing. You need a physician's certificate of capacity. Dr. Cross can do it. 2 witnesses who are not beneficiaries, and a letter in your handwriting explaining why, not typed, yours, even if ugly. My handwriting looks like a spider froze to death, then let the spider testify. Margaret looked at her with grudging respect. You are an unpleasant comfort. I charge extra for pleasant. For more than an hour they worked. Boundaries described. Clay's dispute noted. Harold's likely challenge anticipated. Beverly gave Margaret a blank sheet and envelope. Write the letter tonight, bring it back sealed, or have Reverend Hale deliver it. Your words matter more than mine. When Margaret finally came out, Daniel stood so fast Owen woke and complained. Well? He asked. I am hungry. That's all you need. On the sidewalk, under dripping snowmelt, Margaret raised her voice enough for 2 women in the pharmacy window to hear. Daniel Hayes in my life. I have rarely met a man who apologizes with his posture. Stand up straight. You're not stealing air. He did unwillingly, which made Beverly laugh behind them. On the drive home, Margaret gave him one instruction. If I die before explaining things, go to Beverly Sutton and say 4 words. Ridge has been claimed. What does that mean? It means listen better. Again. Ridge has been claimed. Emma repeated it softly. Owen woke enough to mumble, Ridge clam. Kodiak barked from the truck bed, as if approving the revision. That night, lamplight burned under Margaret's bedroom door until nearly 3. Daniel heard paper tear. Once he heard her say, Words are stubborn little devils. He almost knocked then, saw the family photograph on the mantel turned half away, and behind it, the corner of a sealed envelope. He did not touch it. He only stood there in the stove glow, frightened not of being left this time, but of being wanted. Winter settled back over Whitaker Ridge with a low gray sky and a wind that searched the cabin seams like fingers looking for weakness. The snow had crusted hard enough to hold a man's weight in the morning and betray him by afternoon, which Daniel thought was a fair description of most legal matters. Clay Ramsey did not return at once. Men like Clay preferred to let fear ferment. Instead, people in town began looking too long at Daniel in the feed store. A woman at the laundromat asked Emma whether she felt safe up on the mountain, and Emma stared until the woman remembered a dryer needed inspection. Reverend Hale stopped by with soup and left with his mouth tight after Margaret told him that if he had come to save her soul, he should check whether Clay had bought it first. The Reverend laughed, then asked Daniel outside about paperwork, benefits, emergency contacts, income, custody documents. Every question was reasonable. Every one landed like a stone. That night, Daniel counted pantry cans, logs, and dollars folded in an envelope inside his duffel. Numbers stayed where they were put, unlike rumors. Margaret watched him pace. "If you wear a trench in my floor, you can refinish it. I don't like not knowing the angles. No one does. Some of us simply grow old enough to pretend uncertainty is a hobby." That week, Harold Whitaker came up the ridge. He arrived near dusk in a rusted Subaru that should have died honorably years earlier. It slid twice before reaching the gate, then stopped half sideways. Kodiak stood before the engine quit. Daniel stepped onto the porch, hand open, body ready. Harold climbed out slowly. He was 46 broad, gone soft, hair thinning under a knit cap, cheeks red with cold and drink. He carried a paper sack in one hand as if it might count as purpose. "Aunt Maggie," he shouted. "You home?" Margaret appeared behind Daniel. "No, I'm a memory, with excellent timing." Harold grinned, but it faltered when he saw Daniel. "You the soldier?" "Daniel Hayes. I heard about you." "People do that when they lack chores," Margaret said. Harold looked past him into the cabin where Emma stood with Owen behind her. And the little family. Cozy. The word had slime on it. Daniel felt Kodiak press against his calf before the dog growled. Harold lifted both hands. "Easy. I brought whiskey." "Then you can leave twice," Margaret said. "Once for yourself and once for the bottle." His face reddened. "I came to talk." "You came because Clay Ramsey told you to," the hit landed. Harold's eyes shifted toward the road. "Clay says you're being taken advantage of. Clay says many things. Snow says less and is more useful." Harold steps toward the porch. Daniel did not move. Neither did Kodiak. "This is family business," Margaret laughed softly. "Family business. That's rich from a man who visited Earl's grave once and asked me for gas money beside it." Harold flinched. "I was in a bad place." "You bought a timeshare there and keep renewing." Daniel looked away, not wanting to enjoy that and failing. Shame turned in Harold, as shame often does, into anger wearing boots. "Earl was my uncle. This was Whitaker land before you married in. If you sign it over to some drifter with a war dog, people will ask questions." Emma stepped forward. "Kodiak is not a war dog." Harold blinked. "What?" "He's retired." Owen nodded. "Retired." For one absurd second, the air almost laughed. Harold's mouth twisted. "Cute." Daniel's voice went low. "Careful." Margaret tapped the walker. "No. Let him show his manners. I like knowing what I'm refusing." Harold looked at her, and desperation leaked through the anger. "I have nothing, Aunt Maggie." "I know. No steady job, no house. I sleep behind the auto shop some nights. Clay said if the land comes through, he'll help clear my debts. He said Earl would have wanted blood to keep it." Margaret descended one porch step before Daniel could stop her. "Do you know my children's names?" Harold stared. "What? My children?" "Earl's blood, if blood is your scripture today. Names." Harold opened his mouth, closed it. The trees hissed. Emma's hand found Daniel's sleeve. Harold looked down. "There was a boy, Caleb," Margaret said, "and a girl, Rachel. Rachel made Earl put raisins in pancakes because she thought ordinary pancakes were morally lazy. Caleb broke his wrist falling off the barn and told everyone he had been fighting a bear because he did not want the chickens blamed." Harold's eyes filled. "I was a mess then. You are a mess now. I'm trying, are you?" He looked at Daniel and the children. "You think he's better than me because he stands straight and has a dog that listens? No. I think he is here. That is a low bar, Harold, and you have limboed under it for 16 years. The paper sack dropped into the snow. For a moment he looked less like a threat than a boy who had grown old without becoming a man. Daniel hated that. Enemies were easier when they had no hurt in them.
You can't leave it to him, Harold whispered. Margaret's hands tightened on the walker. I can leave my house to whoever made it a home again. Harold shook his head. Clay says he'll contest. He says you aren't right. He says the veteran has PTSD, and the girl is traumatized, and the boy is half sick, and everyone will believe he found a weak old widow in a storm. Daniel stepped off the porch. That's enough. Harold stumbled back, though Daniel had not touched him. I'm not scared of you. You should be scared of what you're becoming, Daniel said. The words surprised him. They struck Harold strangely. His anger drained, leaving confusion. Margaret saw it. Go home, Harold. I don't have one. The answer was naked enough to still the yard. Margaret closed her eyes. Some cracks let light in.
Some let responsibility. Daniel, make coffee. Margaret, do not Margaret me. Make coffee before this fool freezes in my yard and gives Clay a martyr. Inside, Harold sat at the table with both hands around a mug. He did not drink the whiskey. Daniel poured it down the sink while Harold watched and did not protest. Kodiak lay between Harold and the children, accurate but not cruel. Harold spoke in pieces. His mother died, work dried up, drinking began as weather and became climate. Clay offered money and a story that made him an heir instead of a lonely drunk who did not know the names of the dead. Margaret listened without absolving him. Near midnight, Harold stood to go, sober enough to feel himself. At the door, he looked at Emma. Sorry I called your dog a war dog. Emma considered him. He was one. But he's not only that. Harold nodded as if the correction had traveled further than intended. When his Subaru disappeared, Margaret sagged in the chair. Daniel caught her shoulder before she slipped. If I die before this is finished, you do not leave. Not for shame, not for fear. Not because men with clean coats make the law sound like a locked gate. Ridge has been claimed, Daniel said. Again, Ridge has been claimed. Her eyes closed. Good. Later, as she slept, Kodiak scratched once at the front door. Daniel opened it and stepped onto the porch. Fresh snow was falling. Beyond the gate, at the edge of the trees, a red survey ribbon had been tied to a branch where none had been that morning. March came to Whitaker Ridge wearing dirty snow and a sky the color of pewter, the season when winter begins to look tired but refuses to leave the room. Drifts sagged in the afternoons and hardened at night, trapping footprints like proof. Daniel found the red survey ribbon at the tree line and took it down, but the branch where it had hung seemed to keep pointing. Clay Ramsey had not walked away. Men like Clay waited for age, illness, law, or weather to do what force could not. The illness arrived quietly. Margaret stopped coming to the porch before breakfast. Then she stopped finishing coffee. Then she sat in bed with the red shawl around her shoulders while the cabin carried on below her louder than it had been in years. Daniel noticed and catalogued what he wished not to see. Her breathing after 10 steps, the bluish shade under her fingernails, the way she pretended to sleep while listening to Emma read. He called Dr. Miriam Cross on Reverend Hale's phone because the cabin line crackled whenever the wind came up. The doctor arrived on a Thursday in a station wagon with chains on the tires and a thermos wedged beside her medical bag. She was small, dark-haired, and direct enough that Margaret disliked her immediately, which meant she trusted her by supper. Dr. Cross examined Margaret for nearly 40 minutes while Daniel waited in the kitchen with Emma, Owen, and Kodiak. Owen built a fort from canned beans and defended it from imaginary snow pirates. Emma sat with the gray bear in her lap, moving one button eye with her thumb. Daniel cleaned the same skillet twice. Kodiak lay at the bedroom door and sighed as if human medicine took too long. When Dr. Cross came out, she closed the door carefully. Her heart is failing, she told Daniel. Not dramatically, not today, but steadily. Fluid in the lungs, some mornings, swelling in the legs, fatigue that won't lift. She may have months. Less if infection comes or another storm or another fall. Emma made no sound, which was worse than crying. Daniel looked toward the bedroom.
Hospital?
She'll refuse, and she is competent to refuse. Dr. Cross set a folded certificate on the table. She asked me to evaluate mental capacity. I documented that she is alert-oriented and understands her property and legal decisions. Daniel stared at it. Why give that to me? Because she said one day you would ask the wrong question. The right question is whether anyone can claim she does not know her own mind. Emma spoke. Is Grand Maggie dying? Dr. Cross did not flinch from the name. Yes, honey. Not this minute, and not because anyone failed. Her body is getting very tired. Owen looked up from the bean fort. Nap? Something like that, the doctor said. Margaret called from the bedroom. If you're all holding awake out there, save me a chair. After the doctor left, Daniel went in. Margaret sat upright against pillows, hair unbraided, face thin with exhaustion and satisfaction. You knew. I live in this body. It has been sending resignation letters. He sat beside her. You should have told me. So you could stare at me with funeral eyes for an extra week? No, thank you. He held the certificate. The paperwork. Necessary. The will. Her gaze moved to the window where snowmelt dripped from the eaves. Some doors open after people are gone. Don't make me guess. I am old. Guessing is one of my few entertainments. But her hand reached for his, and when he took it, she did not pull away. I need help, she said. The sentence entered Daniel gently and exploded later. He had heard men call for medics, children call for mothers, his own voice in nightmares calling for Luis. But Margaret saying, I need help, under a leaking roof felt like a metal turned inside out. No shine, only truth. I've got you, he said. She closed her eyes. Careful. That's how people become family around here. From that day, the rhythm changed. Daniel moved a bed downstairs. He learned to lift Margaret from bed to chair without hurting her shoulder. He learned which pills came with food and which made her dizzy. He washed her hair in a basin while she complained that Navy training had neglected scalp courtesy. Emma read to her each evening from Rachel's old school reader, refusing help until Margaret corrected her pronunciation with imperial impatience. Owen climbed beside the bed every morning and placed his yellow hat on Margaret's blanket, then reclaimed it before breakfast because generosity had limits. Kodiak became her shadow, sleeping in the doorway, and once stealing a biscuit from her plate while maintaining eye contact. That dog is a thief, Margaret said. Retired thief, Daniel answered. Spring tried. Daniel cleared the barn roof and repaired 2 stalls. Reverend Hale brought a Marine named Pete Alvarez, a man with shaking hands and nowhere steady to sleep, to help mend fences for a week. Pete barely spoke then, cried quietly into Kodiak's neck on the 3rd night. Margaret saw from the window and said nothing until breakfast. Then she told Pete his coffee was weak and his fence knots were worse. Somehow it made him smile. You could make this place something, she told Daniel after Pete left. A way station. Veterans, children. Dogs nobody knows what to do with, people who need work before they can talk. Daniel shook his head. It's your land, for now. The idea frightened him because it had shape. A shape meant loss could pour itself into usefulness. In April, Emma turned 9. Margaret insisted on baking a cake. Daniel objected on health grounds. Margaret threatened to write that he had denied a dying woman flour. He surrendered. The kitchen became sugar egg coughing laughter and one unfortunate batter print on Kodiak's ear. The cake emerged sunken and scorched. Emma ate 2 slices and declared it perfect. Child never flatter bakers, Margaret said. It encourages collapse. 2 days later, Beverly Sutton called Reverend Hale, who drove up the ridge rather than trust the phone line. His coat was wet with sleet, and his face carried news wrapped in law.
Clay and Harold filed, he told Daniel on the porch. Petition questioning Margaret's capacity and alleging undue influence. Emergency hearing in 3 days. Daniel felt the old flash, but it came weaker now, blunted by months of choosing children and medicine over anger. From inside, Margaret's voice carried clearly. Tell Beverly to comb her hair. If we are going to make fools of fools, we should look respectable. Daniel looked through the window at Margaret propped in bed, red shawl around her shoulders. Emma awake beside her, Kodiak standing at attention. The dying woman had heard everything, and she was not done standing.
The morning of the hearing broke over Bozeman with sleet ticking against shop windows and dirty snow piled along Main Street like tired witnesses. Daniel drove Reverend Hale's borrowed truck through town, while Emma held Owen's hand in the back seat, and Kodiak sat beside them in harness, head high, one torn ear making him look more dignified than any judge. Margaret sat in front, wrapped in her black coat and red shawl, white braid over one shoulder, with a sprig of dried lavender Emma had tucked into it, while Margaret pretended to object. She looked smaller than she had at the cemetery, but her eyes had a brightness that made Daniel nervous. Some fires burn lower before they go out. Some burn hotter. If I faint, she said, do not make a speech. I was planning a musical number. Your humor is improving. That worries me. Emma laughed softly. Daniel counted the sound. 1. He had begun counting new things, laughs, good meals, nights without nightmares. At times, Margaret asked for help without making it wear armor. The courthouse stood near the square, a stone building with salted steps and a flag snapping in wet wind. People had gathered before Daniel parked. Word traveled fast where winter left folks hungry for a story. Especially one with land, a dying widow, a former Navy SEAL, a child with a lopsided bear, and a German shepherd who looked capable of cross-examination. Beverly Sutton met them at the curb in a navy coat and sensible shoes. Dr. Cross stood beside her with a folder. Reverend Hale opened Margaret's door. Daniel reached for her, but she lifted one finger. Chair. What chair? The wooden one from the truck bed. I will not be dragged inside like laundry. Beverly looked at the sky, then Margaret. She was clear in her instructions. I strive to be inconvenient, Margaret said. They placed the chair on the sidewalk near the courthouse steps because Margaret refused the wheelchair Beverly had arranged. Daniel lifted her from the truck. She weighed almost nothing, which frightened him more than weight would have. Emma stood on one side. Owen stood on the other, yellow hat crooked. Kodiak sat at Daniel's heel watching the crowd. Clay Ramsey arrived in his black SUV with a young attorney whose shoes were too shiny for sleet. Harold Whitaker came separately, unshaven, sober, wearing a coat brushed hard but not well repaired. He looked at Margaret, then the ground. Magistrate Ellen Brody emerged when the murmuring grew. She was compact, silver-haired, and shaped by the expression of someone who disliked gossip before coffee. Mrs. Whitaker, we can hear this inside. Margaret shook her head. No. Beverly leaned close. Maggie, no. They say I don't know my mind. Let them hear it where they said it. The magistrate studied her, then stepped down. You understand this is irregular. At my age, so is breathing, yet here we are. Someone coughed to hide laughter. Clay's attorney opened his mouth, but Brody lifted a hand. 7 minutes. Margaret looked at Daniel. Help me stand. He froze. You don't have to. I did not ask what comfort permits. I asked you to help. He took both her hands and lifted. She stood with the walker before her chair behind, body trembling under the shawl. Daniel stayed close enough to catch her, far enough not to hold her up unless asked. That mattered. Margaret looked across the faces, bakery owner, feed clerk, nurses, Reverend Hale, Pete Alvarez, miller's son with plow salt on his boots, strangers who had come for weather and stayed for blood. My name is Margaret Ellen Whitaker.
I am 80 years old. I married Earl Whitaker in 1968. We had 2 children, Caleb and Rachel. Caleb died in an avalanche at 19. Rachel died of cancer at 27. Earl died 2 winters later. I have lived alone on Whitaker Ridge for 16 years. Her voice shook, then steadied. Last winter I fell by my back step.
I lay in the snow until dark. My hip burned so badly I thought I would vomit. No nephew came. No developer came. No one from town came because no one knew. Harold closed his eyes. Clay's face stayed smooth. During the February blizzard, Daniel Hayes came to my gate with his children and his dog. The gate was open. He could have pushed it. He did not. He waited because I had not invited him. His boy was coughing. His girl was freezing. His dog lay on them to keep them warm. I opened the door at midnight because the dog had better Christian instincts than I did. A ripple moved through the crowd, half laughter, half grief. Kodiak sneezed at the exact wrong moment. Margaret glanced down. "Do not get proud." Emma covered her mouth. Daniel looked at the sidewalk until he could breathe. Margaret continued. "Since that night, Daniel has fixed my pump, split my wood, carried me when my legs stopped negotiating, washed my hair when my arms refused, and never once asked me for money, purse, land, or promises. His daughter reads to me. His son calls me Gran Maggie. Their dog steals biscuits and guards my door. If this is undue influence, it is the influence of being picked up after lying too long on the ground." Beverly's eyes shone. Dr. Cross opened her folder. Margaret lifted one shaking hand toward Harold. "Harold Whitaker is Earl's blood. I do not deny it. But blood is not a chair beside the bed. Blood is not water from the pump. Blood is not a child placing a yellow hat on Rachel's grave because he thinks the dead might be cold." Owen looked alarmed at being evidence. Emma took his hand. Margaret faced Clay. "And Clay Ramsey wants a road. He is not evil for wanting one. Men have wanted roads through other people's lives since Cain left the field. But he is wrong if he thinks age makes me public property." Sleet tapped Coates. Magistrate Brody's voice remained official, though her face had softened. "Dr. Cross has provided a capacity certificate. Ms. Sutton has filed your signed statement. Mr. Whitaker, do you wish to proceed?"
Harold looked up. Clay's attorney whispered hard. Harold pulled away. "No, ma'am." Clay turned. "Harold." Harold flinched, then stood straighter. "No, I don't. I didn't know Caleb and Rachel. That's on me. I won't steal their house by pretending I loved what they left." Clay's mask slipped enough to show machinery beneath. "This matter is not over." Magistrate Brody looked at him. "For today, Mr. Ramsey, it is." Beverly placed Margaret's handwritten letter and the medical certificate into the record. "The ridge has been claimed," she said. Margaret's knees buckled. Daniel caught her before the chair tipped, lowering her gently as the crowd surged, then stopped, unsure whether applause belonged in a moment half courtroom, half prayer. Reverend Hale removed his hat. Others followed. On the ride home, Margaret slept with her head against the seat and her hand in Emma's lap. Near the last bend, she woke and looked at the cabin, smoke drawing a thin line into the bruised sky. "I said their names," she whispered. "Caleb, Rachel, Earl. I said them outside in front of people." Emma squeezed her hand. Margaret smiled faintly. "I can rest now." Daniel gripped the wheel. "Not yet." She looked at him with tired kindness. "Oh, Daniel, that is not yours to command." At the cabin, snow began again, soft this time, covering tracks and survey marks. Margaret sat by the window in her rocker, red shawl around her, watching the ridge disappear into white. For the first time since Daniel had known her, she did not look lonely. She looked like someone waiting for a door to open from the other side. April softened Whitaker Ridge with wet snow.
Low clouds and the smell of thawing earth rising from beneath the white, like a secret being reconsidered. The cabin changed its sounds as the season shifted. The roof dripped into a bucket by the back door. The stove no longer roared all day but held coals under ash. The chickens, who had survived winter with the offended resilience of church ladies, scratched at the first patches of mud. Inside, Margaret's world narrowed to the bed by the window, the rocker when strength allowed, and the faces gathering around her in changing light. Daniel had seen men die suddenly and men die by inches. This was different, because Margaret was not being taken from a battlefield. She was departing from a house she had finally re-entered. That seemed both merciful and cruel. He learned the work of her last weeks with the same attention he had once given maps and breach points. Morning pills in the blue dish, warm water with lemon if her throat hurt, pillow behind the left shoulder, lavender oil on the dry skin of her hands, though she claimed it made her smell like a dresser drawer. Emma braided Margaret's hair every evening, her fingers careful and serious. At first the braids came loose before supper. Margaret critiqued them. Emma improved. Owen brought offerings, a button, a pine cone, half a cookie already licked, one of Daniel's socks, which no one could explain. Kodiak slept across the bedroom door and refused to move for visitors unless Daniel gave the old service hand signal. Even then, the shepherd rose with Moro reluctance. Pete Alvarez returned twice a week to help with the barn, and sometimes sat on the porch without speaking. Reverend Hale brought communion once, soup twice, and bad jokes, until Margaret told him his theology was better when edible. Harold came on a Saturday morning, sober, with a repaired fence rail in his truck and shame in both hands. Daniel met him outside. "She may not want to see you." Harold nodded. "I brought the rail anyway." Margaret did see him. She let him stand at the foot of the bed nearly a minute before saying, "You look less pickled." Harold laughed once and cried immediately. After embarrassing himself so much, Emma looked away to be kind. He whispered, "Caleb, Rachel, Earl." Margaret closed her eyes. "Again next time. Names fade if neglected." Clay sent no more letters. Beverly said he had retreated into permits and survey complaints, a language she could fight. Daniel signed nothing, claimed nothing, asked for nothing. He worked because work was how his body understood gratitude. He cleared the barn, patched the roof, stacked wood under proper cover, and built a ramp from porch to yard wide enough for Margaret's chair, though she called it an unnecessary runway. He wrote to 2 veteran organizations and 1 retired working dog rescue, then tore up the letters because they sounded like a man pretending to be qualified for hope. Emma found the pieces in the trash taped enough together to read and placed them beside a clean sheet. "Right ugly," she said. Daniel looked at her. "What, like Grand Maggie's letter?" "Ugly, but yours." That night he wrote the first honest paragraph. "My name is Daniel Hayes. I am a former Navy SEAL, a widower, a father, and a man learning that asking for help does not make the help less deserved." He stared at the sentence a long time. Then he kept going. Margaret noticed his eyes the next morning. "You look like you wrestled a hymn and lost." "I wrote some letters." "Good. Words are awful tools, but they build things hammers can't reach." In the last week of April, Margaret stopped walking. One morning, Daniel found her on the edge of the bed, both hands gripping the mattress, fury and terror equal on her face. The walker stood 2 feet away, useless as a coward's promise. "My legs," she said. "They resigned without notice." He knelt. "I'll lift you." "No." Her voice was sharp, but tears had gathered. "No, I am not a parcel." Daniel waited. Waiting was harder than lifting. Emma stood in the doorway. Owen clutched Kodiak's collar. The dog gave Daniel one brief look, reminding him that patience was also a command. Margaret tried again. Nothing. Her jaw trembled.
Then, with the effort of someone moving a mountain inside her throat, she said, "Help me." Daniel went to her at once. He slid one arm behind her back, one under her knees, and lifted slowly. She weighed less than his rucksack had on training nights. That made his hands shake. He carried her to the chair by the window and tucked the red shawl around her knees. She covered her face. "I am nothing now." Emma stepped forward. "No." Margaret looked at her. "Child, I cannot even reach my own rocker." "You reached the gate." The room stilled. Emma's voice shook, but she did not stop. "You got out of bed in a blizzard when your hip hurt, and Dad wouldn't push it. You opened it."
You made the bear. You said Mom's name with me. You are not nothing. Owen nodded because he trusted his sister's weather. Grand Maggie Gate. Margaret pressed one thin hand to her mouth. Later, when the house quieted, she asked Daniel to bring the envelope from behind the photograph. He did. Margaret held it against her chest. I want to tell you before strangers do. Everything. Cabin, landwell, tools, barn. To you and the children. Daniel's first feeling was panic, then refusal, then something worse. Longing, a place, a roof not borrowed from disaster, a table where his children had crumbs and history both. I can't take that. You can. You may hate it. That is separate. People will say I waited for it. People say many things because silence frightens them. Beverly has my letter. Miriam has the certificate. Harold backed away in public. Clay can gnaw fence posts if he likes. She gripped his hand. I did not pay you. This cannot be paid. I put the paperwork in line with the truth. His eyes burned. I don't know how to be somebody's son. Her smile was faint. Good. I don't know how to be anybody's mother anymore. We'll both be amateurs. At 2 in the morning a week later, Margaret woke clear. Rain tapped the windows, not snow, and the ridge smelled of thawing pine. Daniel. He rose from the chair. I'm here. Tell Emma not to fear love because it has an ending. Everything with breath ends. That is not the argument against it. That is the reason to come closer while the room is warm. He swallowed. Tell her yourself in the morning. Margaret looked at him with sorrowing patience. Still commanding weather. Her fingers tightened. Tell Owen the yellow hat is ridiculous and I love it. Tell the dog he is a thief. Kodiak's tail thumped once. And you, my mistake was not being alone. Sometimes life leaves you there. My mistake was thinking alone made me strong. It made me hard. Strong bends. Hard breaks. Daniel leaned close. You opened the gate. No, she whispered. You knocked. Near dawn, Emma climbed into the bed without asking. Owen followed, dragging his blanket. Daniel lay on the other side, careful of Margaret's fragile body. Kodiak placed his head on the mattress edge. At 6:20, Margaret inhaled and did not exhale. No thunder, just one breath, choosing not to return. Emma pressed her face into the old woman's shoulder and made the sound Daniel had feared for months. Owen patted the red shawl. Grand Maggie. Kodiak sniffed Margaret's still hand, then lay beside the bed with his muzzle on her slipper. Outside, snow began again, soft as ash, and the cabin that had once held one lonely heart held 4 broken ones and a dog keeping watch at the door. The day of Margaret Whitaker's funeral, snow fell over Bozeman in large, quiet flakes that did not bite or blind, but simply came down as if the sky were emptying its pockets of all it had failed to say. Miller's son plowed the road from Whitaker Ridge before sunrise. Daniel had not asked. Reverend Hale had not asked either. The man stepped down from the plow and said, She yelled at me in 2004 for driving too fast past her mailbox. Figured I owed her a slow road. Then he left before gratitude could make things awkward. The wake was held in the cabin because Margaret had once said funeral homes smelled like furniture, pretending not to know. 43 people came by noon. Daniel counted them, then stopped because the number itself began to hurt. Chona Miller brought ham. Dr. Cross brought coffee. Pete Alvarez brought split wood and cried while pretending the stove smoked, though it drew perfectly. Beverly Sutton arrived with a leather folder and no makeup, which made her look older and more human. Reverend Hale prayed beside the plain pine coffin in the front room. Emma placed the gray bear near Margaret's folded hands. Owen wanted the yellow hat on her head, but Daniel convinced him to tuck it beside the coffin.
She said it was ridiculous,
Owen whispered. She did, Daniel said. That means she liked it. Kodiak lay beneath the window, head on paws, refusing food and accepting only Emma's hand on his neck. At 2, a black SUV stopped beyond the gate. Conversations thinned. Clay Ramsey stepped out alone, no attorney, no polished smile. Daniel met him at the porch. He did not block the way, but did not move aside either. Kodiak rose behind him with old quiet in his body. Clay held his hat in both hands. Mr. Hayes, I came to pay respects. Daniel heard several answers in himself, none kind. Then he looked at the coffin. Strong bends, hard breaks. Come in. No business. Clay nodded. No business. Inside he stood by Margaret a long moment. I wanted a road, he said softly. I told myself it was progress, jobs, tax base, words men like me polish. But I saw her at the courthouse. I saw that little boy with the hat. I saw the dog watching her as if she were a post he had been ordered to defend. I understood I had been trying to build a road through a house. Daniel said nothing. Clay swallowed. I withdrew the Northridge claim this morning. Beverly has the letter. Beverly lifted the folder. She does. Emma spoke from the doorway. She was funny too. Clay turned. I missed that part. You missed most of her. Clay accepted the sentence. Yes, I did. He knelt, prayed badly, and left without tea because some remorse is too new to sit at a family table. Near 4, Harold arrived on foot, sober hair combed, wet coat buttoned wrong from nerves. The room went quiet, but not cruelly. I have not come to fight, he said. Daniel believed him, though belief moved carefully. Harold looked at Emma. Could you tell me their names? She knew. Caleb, Rachel, Earl. Harold repeated them as if learning a craft, then stepped inside and stood by the coffin. I'm sorry, Aunt Maggie. I came late. Reverend Hale touched his shoulder. No one made him leave. They buried Margaret under the cottonwood beside Earl, Caleb, and Rachel. The ground was hard, and the men took turns with picks before the grave could be opened. Daniel carried one corner of the coffin. Pete carried another. Harold asked to carry, and Daniel let him take the rear corner for the last 20 feet. Emma walked with Owen, the gray bear, under her arm. Kodiak followed at heel without command. When the coffin descended, Owen broke from Emma's hand and placed his yellow hat on the edge of the grave. For cold, he said. Then he looked down and called, Grand Maggie! The sound moved through the mourners like a hand through water. Daniel bent and picked him up. Emma cried openly now and did not apologize. 3 weeks later, Daniel went to Beverly Sutton's office with Emma, Owen, and Kodiak. Beverly placed the sealed envelope on the table. Mrs. Whitaker said you would come when ready, then said you would wait too long, then told me to forgive you because men with military haircuts are slow at emotional paperwork. Daniel laughed and cried in the same breath. Beverly read the will first. Whitaker Ridge, the cabin, barn, well, tools, livestock, accounts, and all personal effects passed to Daniel Hayes as trustee for himself and his children. Harold received Earl's fishing knife and the right, if Daniel permitted, to work the land for wages. Clay received nothing except withdrawal of access negotiations, which Beverly read with professional pleasure. Then she unfolded Margaret's letter. The handwriting sloped downhill, shaky and stubborn. I, Margaret Ellen Whitaker, being in my right mind and bad temper, attest to this.
I buried my son Caleb,
my daughter Rachel, and my husband Earl. I lived 16 years in a chair, watching a gate no one opened because no one came. In February, Daniel Hayes came through a blizzard with his children and his German Shepherd Kodiak. I denied them shelter. They did not force the gate, though it was open. They waited for an invitation, and the dog had the sense to complain until I found my own. Daniel never asked me for land. Emma never asked me to replace her mother. Owen never asked why old hands shake. Kodiak asked for biscuits and is guilty. They brought water, work, noise, crumbs, prayers, tears, and the intolerable inconvenience of love. If anyone claims I was tricked, let them know they are correct. I was tricked by loneliness into thinking blood is the only family. Then I was corrected. Family is who picks you up when the snow has your back and the world has gone inside. I leave Whitaker Ridge to the people who made it a home while I was still alive to see it. Not as payment, as truth. Let my stone say only this. Margaret Whitaker, 80 years, died accompanied. Beverly stopped twice to wipe her glasses. Emma took Daniel's hand. Owen asked if Kodiak could read too. Daniel said, not yet. 10 years passed, carrying grief in one hand and growth in the other. Whitaker Ridge became Open Gate Ranch, though Daniel resisted the name until Emma painted it on a board and nailed it above the barn while he was in town. The place took in retired working dogs, veterans who could fix engines but not sleep, single parents who needed a roof for a month and stayed long enough to remember their strength. Nobody was called a case. Nobody was asked to tell their story before eating. The first rule framed in the kitchen in Margaret's crooked handwriting was simple. Family is who picks you up. Emma became a teacher in Bozeman. On the first day of every school year, she opened the classroom door herself, even when it was already open, and told each new child, "Come in. There is a place for you here." Owen grew tall, kept the yellow hat folded in a drawer, and trained winter rescue dogs with patience he claimed he learned from Kodiak, who lived to a grand old age and spent his final winter beside the stove, stealing biscuits from people who knew exactly what he was doing. Harold worked the land 8 years sober for 7, and when he died, Daniel buried him 10 paces from the Whitakers because Margaret had left room in mercy, even for late arrivals. One evening, long after Emma had moved into her own apartment and Owen had taken over the kennels, Daniel sat in Margaret's rocking chair for the first time. From there, he could see the porch, the gate, the road curling down toward town, and the place where he had once stood in a blizzard with 2 children and a dog who knew when to howl. He rocked once. The chair creaked. "We opened it for each other, Maggie," he said. Outside, the gate stood open. But every evening, someone from Open Gate Ranch still stepped onto the porch when headlights appeared on the road. Because an open gate is not always enough. Sometimes a hurting person needs to see another person come out into the weather and say, "Come in. There is a place for you here." Some blessings arrive looking nothing like comfort. They arrive as interruption, as a hard knock in terrible weather, as someone whose need exposes our own. Margaret thought strength meant needing no one, and Daniel thought asking for help made him a burden. God used a blizzard, 2 children, and 1 faithful German Shepherd to teach them both a kinder truth. Love is not weakness. Mercy is not a debt ledger. Family is not only the blood that shares our name, but the hands that lift us when we cannot rise alone. If this story touched your heart, write Amen in the comments for the lonely, the grieving, the veterans, the single parents, and the old souls waiting behind quiet doors. Share this with someone who may need courage to knock or courage to open. May your home be warm. May your pride bend before it breaks, and may God send you someone who says, "Come in, there is a place for you here."